Welcome everyone, I'm Maurizio Broggi, Education Director for the Italian Wine Scholar, and today I'm happy to present Ciro Pirone. Ciro is the Director of Italian Wine for Horizon Beverage Company in Boston. Ciro is Italian from Salerno in Campania and is a graduate of the Hotel and Restaurant Management School of Salerno. In 1999, Ciro moved to US, to Boston, and where he became Italian wine specialist for Horizon, and in 2011 he became director of Italian wine to support their expanding presence in the New England market. Ciro has also been previously the US brand manager for the well-known producer Arnaldo Capraio Montefalco in Umbria, considered the top producer for Sagrantino di Montefalco. Ciro is also highly involved in Italian wine education and is also a Vinitaly Italian wine ambassador. Today, Ciro is going to talk about Nebbiolo, and which is considered one of the greatest grapes of Italy. And we are going to explore with him some of the most important, the most important wine growing zone for Nebbiolo. We're going to explore Val d'Aosta, Valtellina, and we go to northern Piemonte, and of course Langhe in Piemonte. There is a chat box on your right side. You can use it to type in your name, tell us where you're from, and to ask any question you may have. Ciro, I will leave now the floor to you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ciro Pirone. Thank you, Maurizio, for the introduction. Yeah, as Maurizio mentioned, I'm from Salerno, so southern Italy, and I've been living in Boston for almost 20 years now. And I'm responsible for the Italian portfolio here at the Horizon Beverage, which is a wholesaler in New England. Italian wine, it's definitely a huge passion, as I believe, for all of you, and thank you for joining in. And logically, the uniqueness of Italy is having so many different local native grapes, and grapes have been there for centuries or longer at times. But definitely one of the ones that we always circle back and we're most fascinated about, and we want to find out more and discover more. It's probably the so-called king of them all, which is Nebbiolo. And by the way, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to, as we go through the presentation, answer some questions if there are any, or maybe at the end if it's easier. So Nebbiolo, as I mentioned, is really the king of them all because as it says right here in the front of the presentation, the many shades of a great grape. So Nebbiolo is one of those grapes which is truly unique because not only is very localized, but at the same time it's been able to transcend and translate the terroirs in a very unique way, which not many other grapes in the world have that potential to do. And that's what truly makes it very special and very unique, moving from one area to the other. But let's see what Nebbiolo, a little bit about the history of the actual grape varietal. So this is a very ancient grape because way back then, already almost 2,000 years ago, Pliny the Elder, there was some documentation where there was a grape called Nubiola in Latin, and the more current translation of the word is Nebbiolo. And but as far as the actually written documentation, it is one of the oldest grape varietals in Italy. The oldest documentation is of 1268, which we find. And as I mentioned, Nebbiolo, it's one of those grapes that lives in a very circumscribed area. So it's not a traveler, as many other grapes can be of Italy, but not only. So we only find in a very specific area, which is truly the north western part of Italy, and it takes, depending on the area where it grows, it takes different names for different reasons. As you can see between parentheses, some of the most common names of Nebbiolo are Spanna, Chiavennasca, and Picotener. So Nebbiolo is different. At times we say there's different clones, but in reality these are biotypes. So practically the ones that are most important that we know are the Nebbiolo Miquet, and Miquet, it's in reference to the Piemontese word mica, which is basically the name of a small loaf of bread because the shape of the bunch itself, and that is the most important of the biotypes of Nebbiolo. The second one is the Nebbiolo Lampia, And then there was another one called Nebbiolo Bolla, although that's kind of disappearing, really not the highest quality of the Nebbiolo biotypes. And there was a fourth one, which I put in between parentheses, Nebbiolo Rosé, because for the longest time it was thought to be part of the same family of the Nebbiolos, but more recently, through DNA research and studies, they discovered that Nebbiolo Rosé is nothing else but rather a different, totally separate varietals, which is much lighter in color, more roses, perfumes, hence the name Nebbiolo Rosé. So, although it's still basically permitted into the production of not only the Langhe wines, but wines based on Nebbiolo and Piemonte, but at the same time it's the totally separate varietals from the Miquette and Lampia. Nebbiolo, it's a late ripening varietals. It's definitely sensitive to spring frosts and autumn rains, so really likes a drier environment. Usually elevation that is between 300 and 350 meters of elevation, and for the most part south facings. That's why when we look at, and we'll see that more in depth as we move through the slides, we'll see that Nebbiolo, especially in the Langhe area of Piemonte, Barolo, Barbaresco areas, it likes south, southeast, southwest facing, never the north, which is truly dedicated more to grapes such as Dolcetto. It is a thick-skinned varietal. It's very high in two main things, tannins and acidity, which also give incredible longevity to the wines based on Nebbiolo. But it is an unstable coloration. That's why we see that Nebbiolo, it's one of those few grapes in the world that even at a very young age, it's always pretty much garnet in color, very light in color with the garnet tinges, orange rim, and that's true. That's due to the actual unstable coloration of the pigments of the skin itself. Now, when we smell, generally speaking, we smell wines based on Nebbiolo varietal. We see some of the main aromatics are always going to be floral notes, which we get, violets, rose petals. For the most part, they tend to be like dried, a little bit dried out, withered. Cherry and rubber, so red fruits, and at the same time, earthy notes. So lots of tar, again, dry rose petals. So, but the main characteristic is pretty much like floral, spices, and red fruits. That's what we get out of Nebbiolo. So moving on, this is a map, a global map that actually shows you, as I was mentioning, Nebbiolo is not one of those varietals that travels well or likes to travel, but it's very finicky about a very specific site. You see how much Nebbiolo it's planted in Italy, and when I say Italy, anyway, I'm referring to only that small northwestern corner of the country versus the rest of the world. Sure, there are plantings in other parts of the world, as you can see, Australia, South America, even North America, and in other parts of Europe, but in reality, it's very rare that we see commercially Nebbiolos coming from other countries. And if we do, they're not necessarily bad wines, but they're going to have a totally different flavors. They're never going to really showcase the Nebbiolos of Piemonte as well as Lombardia and Valle d'Aosta. So it's interesting to know that. So this map now, we're zooming in a bit more into the area of production, so the northwest part of Italy and the areas. So going from east towards the west, we have the first area we encountered. It's called Valtellina, which is an area of the northern part of Lombardy on the border with Switzerland, where the Alps are located. Then the next one would be Alto Piemonte, which is basically the northern appellation of the region of Piedmont, nearby Lake Maggiore. Then we see right next to it, slightly moving to the west, is the area of Donnas, which is in the Bassa Valley of Valle d'Aosta, and probably the most famous of them all, where some of the greatest wines and commercially more important wines come from, in the Langhe, which is the southern part of Piemonte, very close to the border with the region of Liguria. So these are the four zones where Nebbiolo excels, make great wines, although there's one more region in Italy where Nebbiolo is planted and is produced, and that is the region of Sardinia, although commercially we don't hear much about that, but it is there because, as you probably knew, Piemonte together with Sardinia was part of the Regno di Sardegna at one point prior to the unification of Italy in 1861. So we start from the small region of Valle d'Aosta. As we all know, it's a very mountainous region. This region is shaped by the river, the Dora Baltea. Dora Baltea is a river that starts west into the Alps and then flows east down and kind of southeast, if you will, and through the years and centuries and century basically carved a central part of the region, which eventually gave the name to the region itself as Valle d'Aosta. Here is one of those areas of Italy where we consider viticulture heroic, because the vineyards are very, very steep, extreme high elevation. Everything has to be done manually, so it requires a huge amount of work on the part of the producers. And that's why for a very long period of time it was inactive, because people just gave up. But fortunately, many small producers have gone back and they're making some fantastic wines. When we think about Nebbiolo in the region of Valle d'Aosta, we think about, as I mentioned before, the Bassa Valle, which is the easternmost part of the region, right where, I don't know if I have an arrow, but it's right here. Let me get the pointer. So basically right here, we see the town of Donnas, so the small village of Donnas, and then some other couple of small villages which are nearby, called Bar, Perlos, and Pont Saint-Martin. But that's pretty much the area where Nebbiolo can still produce some quality wines. If it was planted the further north into the Valle Centrale or the Northern Valley, the conditions would be too extreme, too cold for Nebbiolo to ripen. The soils here in this area are predominantly schistous, so rocky soils that we find, which give wines a great minerality. And the wines are based on Nebbiolo with a minimum of 85%. And in this area, Nebbiolo is called the Picotendro, which is basically a local name given to the varietal itself. So when we look at wines of Donnas, these wines are have an aging requirement, just as pretty much every other wine based on Nebbiolo. And typically appear the aging requirement minimum of Nebbiolo is 24 months with a 10 months minimum in oak, just to give the wine a bit more structure, intensity, and a bit more tannins, which sometimes appear they're not as austere as we find a little bit more moving further south. The wines, generally speaking, they're lighter in color than the counterparts from Piemonte, or even more so in the Langhe part of Piemonte. They're less tannic, they have extreme high acidity, and they tend to give a lot, aromatically speaking, lots of floral notes, red berries. So very persistent, very elegant wines on the nose, but not maybe as age-worthy as some other wines based on Nebbiolo. But there is also another small commune, as you see on the map right here, which is called Arnade, and the wines are called Arnade Montchauvet. And these wines are still based on Nebbiolo, but the requirement there of Nebbiolo in the blend is only 70% rather than 85%. So the wines tend to be slightly different compared to the ones of the Nas. And as you can see from this beautiful picture here, right on the bottom, basically this is the valley, the Dora Balte Valley that was carved from the river course for over thousands of years. And you'll see on the side here of the hills. So bear in mind that these are all south-facing vineyards. Understandably, in order to be able to ripen Nebbiolo, you have to be facing south, especially being at such high elevation, and also facing north. You encounter all the cold winds coming down from the Alps, so Nebbiolo will never be able to thrive there. So in these vineyards, I will see from the next image, they were practically carved by people. So incredible amount of work to be able to continue viticulture up there. And this is the well-known or traditional system called Pergola Valdostana, which is the system used up in Valle d'Aosta. So you see it's quite archaic and quite ancestral as far as a trellising system method structure. And because first of all, they would use stone because that's what they would have right there. So it was available, so they would have the structures built out of stone. And secondary, because as you see right above this pillars, get this thing. Right above the pillars, you see these big long wooden poles that basically are holding all the vines. So the weight is fairly intense, fairly heavy. So they need this big structure to be able to really hold the whole structure together. And at the same time, because we are in a fairly high elevation, these rocks that you find all around the vineyards, the part of this pergola structure, they were able to absorb heat during the course of the day and eventually slowly release the heat during the afternoon, and more importantly during the evening hours, because you got to understand, being at such high elevation, conditions can change quite dramatically when it comes to swings of temperature between day and night time. So for that reason, And logically, the pergola plays two different roles in the importance of winemaking in the region of Valle d'Aosta. This is more of a structure we find in the northern part of Valle d'Aosta. In the southern part of Bassa Valley, there's still a pergola, but the pergola tends to be more like built out of wood rather than stone. But again, it's important to understand that this specific side of Italy has its own unique training system. Right? So we moved to the east, so we were in Valle d'Aosta. If you go east in the region of Lombardia, here I named it the extreme Nebbiolo because, again, if we felt like we were in a very challenging environment, challenging condition, which is that of Valle d'Aosta, probably even more so we find that here in the area of Valtellina. So this is another valley. It's a valley that basically it was created by a different river, the river Adda, that flows down from the Alps and goes westwards. So from west runs towards the east. And also up here, there's another area of Italy where viticulture is considered heroic because we have very extreme high elevations, extremely steep vineyard sides. And so everything has to be done manually. So even the fruit has to be, at times, the wineries that can afford that, they would use a helicopter to actually, after the grapes would be harvested, they would pick them up on this, larger crates and with helicopters and then bring them down to the valley floor where the, wineries and facilities are located. So extremely challenging. But this is a very fascinating area of Italy. All the vineyards, again, they're all located on the northern part of the valley, facing south, so there are no vineyards whatsoever that face north, otherwise you wouldn't be able to ripen Nebbiolo here as well. And the main area, which is a DOCG appellation, is called Valtellina Superiore, DOCG. So within this area called Valtellina Superiore, we find, and supposedly anyway, this is the area of origin of Nebbiolo, although Nebbiolo is very famous in Piemonte, in southern Piemonte, even more so in the Langhe, but supposedly this is the area of origin of the grape varietal itself, and then eventually traveled as people moved around. But anyway, so in Valtellina Superiore, DOCG, we find 5 different subzones, and you see them listed right there. So practically they are Maroggia, Sassella, Grumello, Inferno, and Valgella. And as we go from each one of these subzones can be listed on the label of the bottle. When they're not listed, you see Valtellina Superiore DOCG, for the most part, tend to be a wine that is a blend of different vineyard sites, coming from the area. But most times they're not, because the area is not gigantic, and also there's not a lot of production overall. You're going to see the vineyard site or the subzone site, which are again Maroggia, Sassella, Grumello, Inferno, and Valgella. So as we move from the easternmost part of the area, right here, we find basically the area of Valgella, and we're going to move westward. So Valgella is basically the subzone that gives the wines that tend to be the most fruit forward, slightly lighter, not so much tannin and structure, and lots of red fruit, lots of floral notes, so very, very pleasant wines, but not the boldest of the area. Then the next zone that we encounter as we move a little bit more westwards, right here, kind of in the middle of the Valtellina, is the area called Inferno, and I'm sure everybody already knows, Inferno refers to the hell, or due to the fact that conditions are extremely hot here, very rocky terrain. So the sun in high elevation, so practically the sun beats onto the rocks, and the rocks absorbs the sun. So when the harvest time comes, workers have to come and work in this extremely steep, high elevation condition, extremely hot. That's why the area was named Inferno. And the wines of this specific subzone, they tend to be the ones that have the boldest structure, the hardest tannins, definitely tend to be the most austere. So these are the wines that have a fantastic aging potential, probably the best aging potential of the overall Valtellina area. And then the next subzone that we find as we move a little more west, it's called Grumello. Grumello also has a very good aging potential, somehow similar to the Inferno, but the wines tend to be a bit more softer, a bit more kind of a rounder on the palate. So the tannins are not so steer, they're not so sharp, not so edgy, if you will, but rather more integrated into the wine, a very, very pleasant wine. And then even slightly westward, we find Sassella. and Sassella gives wines that have a decent aging potential, very pleasant. They have good, again, red fruits notes, tend to be fairly floral, and these are wines that definitely for maybe a bit more earlier consumption, they can be very enjoyable, but also very, very elegant. So for people like a bit more refined tannins, a little bit more softer, these are good wines. And then lastly, the Maroggia. Maroggia is the newest, 2002, became one of the subzones of the Valtellina. So it's not so developed yet as far as one of the subzones, but it's there, and maybe it's worth discovering at times too. Sometimes on the label you might see this name. It's kind of a bit of a strange name, but it's called Stagafasli, which you see right here on the slide. Stagafasli refers to basically a wine of the Valtellina, where the fruit comes logically from the Valtellina area, but it's bottled in nearby Switzerland. As you see here from the map, this is the border of Switzerland. So some of the producers, they might actually have facilities in Switzerland, although the vineyards are located in the Valtellina area, so they can bottle in Switzerland, but they have to call it Stagafasli. And when it says Stagafasli, it's not a subzone by any means, and at the same time cannot have on the label also the name of a subzone, even if the fruit comes from one of the 5 legally delimited subzones. When we are in Valtellina, the wine has to be made out of a minimum 90% Nebbiolo. Most of the producers and quality producers, they're going to give you, wine based 100% Nebbiolo, but that 10% of other grape, complementary grape, is permitted because, again, depending on the conditions of the vintage, at times Nebbiolo might need a bit more support from other local grape, maybe to intensify color, maybe to intensify a bit more the aromatic profile. So that's why it's there. And then there is another DOCG produced exactly in the same area, named Sforzato di Valtellina. This is one of the most unique styles of Nebbiolo, probably the most unique of them all, because it's made in the same exact way as an Amarone is produced. So practically by the process of appassimento. So the grapes after the harvest, which generally we're talking about the first into second decade of September, the grapes then are laid down and dried out at least until the mid of November. So it's quite an extended period of time. At times they can be actually dried out even longer, depending on the producer's choice. But the grapes are dried out, so that creates heavy concentration of sugar, which eventually are fermented, and understandably that's going to give you wines which are going to be more unctuous, richer, definitely more alcoholic, with more flavorful, intense structures on the palate, definitely darker fruit notes. So they're very unique wine, and also the beauty of it is that it balances the richness of fruit, the almost like this extraction, richness, jamminess, but with the tannins which are typical of Nebbiolo. As far as aging requirement, in the Valtellina Superiore, it's a minimum of 24 months and at least 1 year to be spent in oak. At times, you can also see Valtellina Superiore o Sforzato in the form of Riserva. And in that case, would require a minimum of 3 years of aging altogether, which still 1 year has to be passed through wood, right? So the wines here, again, high in acid, lots of dried out fruit, very ethereal, and lots of earthiness, which is very, very typical of these areas. And as we saw, Donnas, in the area of Donnas, the Nebbiolo was called Picotendro. Here in the area of Valtellina, the grape is called Chiavennasca, so just a different name that you're going to see, but that's nothing else but a Nebbiolo. I'm just going to see if there's a, maybe Maurizio is answering some of the questions because I'm just running through. Maybe I'll look at it at the end, or maybe hold them till the end as the screen is small. It's hard to read as I go here. But that's Nebbiolo, and we'll see right here. This is another image that shows you kind of similar to a certain degree of the area of the Valle d'Aosta, where basically you have this very long ancient river course valley with very steep vineyards, and these are all formed by, or were created by, incredible amount of labor. It's called Moretti Estate, which are basically these dry walls. See all the rocks, these are all basically alluvial rocks that were brought by the rivers over thousands of years, and they were picked up from the bottom here, brought up here, and they created all these walls. These are all retaining walls because, again, being so steep, you can't, the gradient is just so steep that you wouldn't be able to work the vineyards unless they created this, if you will, steps, one step here, one step here, and then moving, up. So it's very unique. That's why it's also considered a heroic site for viticulture. Now we're going to move into Piemonte. So Piemonte, you really have, as far as Nebbiolo is concerned, you really have to break it down into different areas because the north is dramatically different for various reasons from the south. So in the north, we have another nickname, if you will, although it's a biotype, but it's another nickname given to Nebbiolo, and it's called Spanna. That's the local name. And as far as soil compositions, here in terroir, here in northern Piemonte, we find mostly a soil type called morenic. So morenic soil that we find a little bit everywhere in northern Italy at the bottom of the base of the lakes. It's a soil formation that was created by the bulldozing effect of the glaciers during the glacial age. As the bulldozers advanced, they basically crushed and crumbled everything was on their way and formed these new layers of morenic soils, which are very mineral rich and give wines of again great minerality, great intensity. And up here in the northern part of Piemonte, we find the different subzones, as you can see them marked in different colors here. Different appellations. We find Gemme, Gattinara, Lessona, Bramaterra, Boca, Sizzano, and Fara. These are probably the most important. But definitely the two that are most important are these two, called Gemme and Gattinara. Also because these two appellations were historically very, very famous. Way before Barolo and Barbaresco, for that matter, were famous, and commercially important. Gemme and Gattinara, instead, they were like already very well known for the quality of wines. So very important to know that they exist, and nowadays there's been a revival of both Gemme and Gattinara commercially, so you're definitely going to see them in the market. And up here, definitely Nebbiolo is the most important varietal, but again, we're not at 100%, although most of the producers are going to do 100%, but that being said, there's different requirements depending on the different appellation. And the other blending varietals, the most typical ones that we're going to find are these two, which are Vespolina and Uvarara, also known as Bonarda. So things vary depending on the subzone. And the subzones are divided because there's two provinces on one side and the other, and they're divided by the Sesia River, which is basically the river that splits into all these various subzones of production. So now these are the two that are the most important. They're called Gattinara and Gemme. So Gattinara, is this pink one here on the western side of the Sesia River, versus Gemme, it's right here, and it's exactly on the opposite side of the Sesia River, so the eastern side. So now it's interesting how these wines, when you put them next to each other, they can be dramatically different, although they're literally abutting each other, pretty much same exact soils. But what makes a dramatic difference in the two wines, when you look at the map, see actually this picture that I took from Google Earth. So this is the village of Gattinara with the vineyard site surrounding it, and this basically this wooded area, this forest that surrounds Gattinara. This is the course of the Sesia River that runs from north to south, and this is the township or village of Gemme, and with the vineyards on both sides and whatnot. But the main difference, so Gattinara, it's located at a slightly higher elevation compared to Gemme. And in Gattinara, for example, the minimum aging requirement of Nebbiolo into the wines is 90%, versus in Gemme, which is slightly lower elevation, and the requirement is 85%. So now that gives you merely an indication of the fact that wines are going to be slightly different from each other. Not only the elevation of the two places, but the legislator decided that in Gattinara you can have 90% because of the area, or where the vineyards are, is protected by the woods or the forests. So the cold air coming from the north, when we are very close to the Alps, affects a lot more Gemme, because Gemme is more wide open, it's not as protected. So for that reason, the legislator way back then decided that in the case of Gemme, you have to give a bit more possibility of blending. That's why it's 85% minimum Nebbiolo, 15% is blended of different grapes potentially, versus in Gattinara is only 10% potentially blended of other grapes, because again the ripening potential is less in Ghemme compared to Gattinara. So the wines are logically they're gonna be different. So you're gonna have wines that are gonna be more lean in the case of Ghemme. Still both cases are going to be very mineral driven wines, good tannins, but in case of Ghemme definitely a bit more leaner versus definitely more intense and structured both on the nose and palate in the case of Gattinara. But overall the wines have very beautiful dried out fruit aromas. They have this almost like rusty and rustic earthy notes, high acidity, and overall leaner in color compared to the counterparts of the southern part of Piemonte. But definitely beautiful wines, worth discovering. If you have the opportunity to purchase the wines from the various appellations that we find in northern Piemonte, I strongly suggest so. And also there is a so-called catch for the western part of the appellation. Here there's a catch-all appellation called Coste della Sesia, which basically it's a blend of different as well as Colline Novaresi on the eastern side. Basically they're nothing else but blending wines produced out of fruit that come from the different areas. These are some of the pictures also to show you how dramatic this part of Piemonte is. You have the Alps right in the background that they shield basically northern Piemonte from the cold air coming from northern Europe, but at the same time the vineyard sides are completely covered by snow in the coldest months of the year. So definitely a totally different environment and terroir compared to southern Piemonte and the Langhe area. So moving into the area that is probably the one that people know the most, see the most, is the wealthiest commercially. This is an area of Italy, Langhe, that until pretty much around World War II and right after World War II was fairly poor. This is an area where the main type of culture was wheat. You find a lot of nuts, hazelnuts especially, hence the fact that Nutella is actually from produced in Piemonte, so lots of hazelnut fields. Not so much the vine, because the area was very poor, so people were migrating to cities, like industrial cities like Torino, where Fiat was very popular, or migrating to Milano. So everybody left behind, the farm life, if you will, and so very, very poor. But eventually the vine started taking over, and people realized the immense potential and the wealth that could bring. So when we look at Langhe, first and foremost, we want to know that the actual term Langhe comes from the Italian word lingua. It comes originally from a Celtic word anyway, but Italian word lingua, which means tongue, because the way these hills are shaped and formed reminds you of a series of tongues of land. So here we are in southern Piemonte, a totally different area. So conditions are very much different. As you can understand, they're warmer, sunnier, and that translates into the wines. Wines are going to have more ripeness, fruitiness, a bolder structure, and definitely more alcohol due to the sugar we find in the grapes. As far as soil composition, in the Langhe, one of the major components is going to be, these are called heavier soils, so they're richer, and they have more clay, so they're overall darker. So we're going from morainic soils, very rocky, very mineral driven, to a much darker soil composed of clay, which again right there gives you an indication of what the wines are going to be like when you see them in the glass, as far as color, as far as intensity on the nose, but most importantly also as far as intensity on the structure and tannins and the, fuller bodied type of wines. So definitely the more fruit driven overall compared to, and again, when you say fruit driven for Nebbiolo, you're still talking about, it's not like by any means Cabernet Sauvignon or Malbec, but again, these wines are more fruit driven than the northern counterparts. So this is definitely arguably the best part or the best place for production of the highest quality Nebbiolo wines. And this is the one area of Italy, and one area where Nebbiolo is grown and produced and made into wine, where 100% Nebbiolo appellations have been created, and that's due to the permissiveness of the terroir and the environment, meaning that because here conditions are so much milder, because elevations are not so steep, and because logically the facings tend to be all south as well, here you can fully ripen Nebbiolo to the point where it needs to be, so it really does not need any help of complementary varietal to add, unless it's a very poor vintage, but that's due to Mother Nature. You don't have the same extremes of conditions that you're going to find, as we just saw, in Valtellina, in Valle d'Aosta, and also in northern Piemonte. So things are very, very different. So, and in this part of Italy, and that's true for the Langhe in general, especially when we zoom into Barolo and Barbaresco, there's always been a crew mentality and the Burgundian influence. So really, Piemonte as a region, if you have to compare it to another great wine region of the world, Burgundy would be the region for a few reasons. Because one of them being that they work on wines that are monovarietal, so they believe in that. Yes, you can find some blends, but you think about all the great wines of Piemonte, whites and reds, they tend to be monovarietal. And also they believed very strongly in the defining the terroirs. So it wasn't just about producing Barolo or producing Barbaresco, but rather start studying the terroir and understanding how different it can be from one site to another, especially for a grape like Nebbiolo, that, as I mentioned, is a great translator of the terroirs. So anyway, here in the Langhe, that's where they did the so-called Italian word zonazione, or zoning, which is basically the crew single vineyard isolation and registration. So they started the study way back then in the 70s. The main difference between here and Burgundy is that there's no classification. So you're not going to find sites that are first Great Grand Cru versus Grand Crus, but rather they all are called megas or MGAs. Although potentially something could happen because some sites, like for example Canubi, which was the first ever classified site, which there are still some Barolo in existence, spelling the word Canubi on the label before Barolo existed as a wine, which tells you about the importance of certain sites historically. Then we have some vineyards that are official versus unofficial. So meaning some the official ones are the ones that are actually listed were part of the megas, and they are, as you can see, in the case of Barolo, 170. So a lot to study here, and in the case of Barbaresco, 67. Just to mention a few, you probably, logically, there's many that are great vineyards, but, logically, Cerequio, Canubi, Sarmassa, and the Bricco delle Viole, Falletto, there's just so many, but these are some of them. And in Barbaresco, instead, the area is much smaller. We find less single vineyards. Probably the largest, the one most commonly seen is Ovello, but the ones probably that have most renown are Asili and Rabayà, which we find both in the village of Barbaresco proper. And then two words you're going to commonly see on Barolo, Barbaresco wines, but that's true also for Barbera and Dolcetto. It's not just for Barolo and Barbaresco, but most importantly on Barolo and Barbaresco, because that shows you how these people they want to define the terroir. So by writing Bricco and Sori on the label, right there it's an indication that a Bricco refers to the sun-catching crest of a hill. So practically it's the hilltop vineyard, where basically the sun is caught at 360 degrees. So it's going to give you right there an indication that this is going to be, it's a full exposure vineyard. They're going to be the fullest, boldest, more fruitiest wines versus a Sori. And that, by the way, this is a kind of an idea of a Bricco. It's a hilltop vineyard with a 360 degrees exposure versus this next picture to the right, you see a Sori. So Sori, instead, it's a single vineyard, but it's a vineyard, it's a hillside vineyard that has only a specific exposure. Now, that exposure can be southeast, south, southwest, but it's not going to be at 360 degrees. So the wines tend to be a little bit harder. And again, this is a general term, but they tend to be more not as fruit forward. They tend to be maybe more high in acid, a little bit less richness on the mouthfeel, a little less concentration. But that's kind of the meaning of the Sori and Bricco words that you're going to see on the label. So when we look at Barolo and Barbaresco, although they're very close to each other, because these two villages, they're only about 15-20 minutes apart, there are differences, and that's why also when the legislator created the regulation or disciplinare of rules to make a wine called Barolo and to make a wine called Barbaresco, the things are different. Both wines have to be 100% Nebbiolo, as I mentioned down here. But in the case of Barolo, the aging minimum requirement is 38 months, which 18 months have to be spent in wood. In the case of Barbaresco, it's 26 months, of which 9 months in wood. And for both wines, you have the possibility to have the verbiage riserva on the label. So this is, in the case of Barolo and Barbaresco, this is an exception to the rule, meaning that typically Italian wine, when you see the word riserva, means that the wine is aged for a year longer than the typical wine. But in the case of Barolo and Barbaresco, it's an exception because, as you can see, it's 2 years for a Riserva versus the regular aging. And so in the case of Barolo Riserva, the aging is much longer, it's minimum 62 months, but the wood aging does not change as far as the legality. Then producers might decide to extend it, but as far as the legal aspect, it still remains 18 months in wood for Barolo, 9 months in wood for Barbaresco. So the wines of Barolo, they tend to be, garnet, but still with a pale tone to it. Very, very rigid, intense tannins, bold flavors of fruit, and very strong also alcoholic content around the 14% or so, depending on the vintage or producer. There's in Barbaresco, which is considered to be the queen of the two. So it's a bit more the elegant style, the refined style, the more like a nuanced on the nose without so much bold tannins. The wines are still pale garnet with an orange rim. They're less tannic. They're friendlier, more approachable to enjoy. And this is also due not only to the fact that because both wines are 100% Nebbiolo, so why is there such a difference between the two? And we'll see in the next slide the difference really comes from the terroirs, which are dramatically different. And because of that, the wines are different and the requirements of aging are quite different, and ultimately when they're ready to drink. So in the case of Barbaresco, instead we have a bit more, as far as flavors, a bit more red fruits, strawberry, raspberry, definitely cherry, almost like a cherry syrup, if you will. And then the typical floral notes are still very persistent. So roses, potpourri, very floral. So very, very beautiful wines, definitely. I'm sure plenty of you has had them. But I strongly suggest start discovering the cruise of Barolo and Barbaresco, which will be dramatically different between each other. And this is a map of basically the area of Langhe. So this is the limitation of the Langhe. So we're in southern Piemonte. We want to kind of paint this picture in your mind as you continue to study Barolo, Barbaresco, and the wines based on Nebbiolo. And this is the famous river of southern Piemonte called Tanaro. So the Tanaro River basically cuts pretty much all the main vineyard areas that we find in the southern part of Piemonte, so in the Langhe area. And practically what happened was a few thousands of years back, there was a major shift in or movement in the earth, and that brought up to the light or to the surface much older soils. As a matter of fact, when we think about specifically the area of Barolo, which is this tiny area composed of 11 communes or municipalities, and this is the area of Barbaresco composed of only 3 small townships, Barbaresco, Treso, and Neve. Whereas in Barolo, we know we have La Morra, Barolo, Castiglione Falletto, Serralunga, Monforte d'Alba, which are the 5 most important at the core, and out of which practically 80% of the production of wines come from. And then we have the surrounding tiny villages, which can only be part of it, part of the Barolo area. But anyway, this line you see in yellow, this is where was the ancient river course of the Tanaro River before this major, earthquake or earth movement took place, and this is the current, course of the Tanaro River. So things shifted, and on the side of the Barolo appellation, so the eastern side, is where this much ancient soil was brought back up to life, and that's where basically we call the elevation, or to be more correct, should be called Serravallian, from the name of the actual valley and the village of Serravalle, Serralunga d'Alba. But anyway, so that's the major difference that we have to pay attention to when we think about the wines of Barolo and Barbaresco. As especially Barolo, because in Barolo we're going to have the western side, is the Tortonian soil. Still very ancient soil. As you can see, it goes between 7 million and 11 million years old. But the wines from that area, when we think about La Morra specifically, La Morra tends to give you the wines that are the most approachable, the ones that have, still the typical tannins of Nebbiolo, but their tannins, they're much more approachable and youthful. The wines are more floral, they're more supple. They're definitely wines that, that you can enjoy sooner, and that's why traditionally also La Morra was a big blending partner in all the classic Barolos, so the blended Barolos of the area. And then south of it you have Barolo, the village itself, and Barolo is where the wines tend to be the most complete, if you will, because it kind of sits right on the line between the Alsatian and Tortonian soil. Versus when we move on the eastern side, which is the Serravallian, also known as Alsatian, if you will, one or the other they're typically used. This is where we find the most ancient of the soils of the Barolo area, and is where practically Castiglione Falletto, Serralunga d'Alba, and a good part of Monforte d'Alba to the south sit on. And here the soils still have a big element of clay, lots of sandstone. Versus on the other side we find more sandier soils, still with some clay and limestone. And practically, anyway, the wines from this area, they tend to have much more structured, powerful tannins. They tend to be wines that are much more age-worthy. And that's where we find some of the most traditional historical producers too, where they've been making wines that have given the famous name to the Barolos of the world. Versus Barbaresco is different because Barbaresco, it's as an area, it's smaller, is more homogeneous, so practically the elevations are going to be fairly similar. You're not going to have spikes of elevations from one area to the other as you might see in Barolo. And also sits purely on a Tortonian soil. So again, overall is more homogeneous. You're not gonna have dramatic differences, other than sure you're gonna have the single vineyard differences and the producer philosophy difference, which still plays a big role behind the wines. So kind of hopefully clearly enough, I gave you a picture of what Nebbiolo can be as it's broken down in from the different parts of northwestern Italy, but most importantly here in the Langhe, and most specifically in the Langhe in areas like Barolo and Barbaresco. And here, well, this is just a picture. This is the very beautiful bucolic place of the hillsides of the Langhe area. And as you can see, elevations here, they're not so steep. Here it's sunnier, they're more open. There's like beautiful, so logically gives the wines Nebbiolo a great potential for ripening at its fullest, which is very critical for this variety, much more than others. And then last but not least, just some regulations. This is more there to kind of give you an idea. As we mentioned, you go from Langhe Nebbiolo, which is kind of the blended and the catch-all appellation of southern Piemonte. And also, when you look at the yield per hectare, it tends to be much higher compared to some of the other wines, right? Barbaresco and Barolo, as we said, have to be 100% Nebbiolo grape varietal, and the yield is exactly the same. So it's 8 tons per hectare and 7 tons, 0.20 when you go down to single vineyards. So that's the legislator that says, okay, if you're making a single vineyard, Barolo and Barbaresco, the production has to be even less than a typical Barolo and Barbaresco, and definitely much less than Langhe Nebbiolo, that is the catch-all appellation. And same is true when you look at the Gattinara and Gemme, which are the northern appellation-based Nebbiolo wines. Different percentages, as we explained, based on the openness and the elevation and the terroir of those areas. And see, they follow exactly the same guidelines, or vice versa, actually. These two follow the guidelines of these two, which existed previously, and of 8 tons per hectare. And Donnas, which is also his own, basically, requirement, 85% Nebbiolo, and here the yield per hectare is fairly low. And last but not least, we see Valtellina, that both in the case of Superiore and Sforzato is 90% Nebbiolo, 8 tons per hectare, and then all the various aging requirements and whatnot. So this is just to give you kind of an idea by looking at some numbers of minimum requirements of grapes, aging, as well as the yield per hectare that definitely defines how Nebbiolo from Valtellina is versus the one of southern Piemonte, northern Piemonte, and Valle d'Aosta. But ultimately, the beauty of Nebbiolo is able to translate the message of the terroir that is very unique in every site that we talked about. So I think this was the last slide. I'm gonna leave. If you have any questions, I'm here available. I think I ran out of the time that I had available, right, Maurizio? Actually, okay, let's see. Some people are typing. Yeah, I believe the copy of the slides. So Sherry was asking if the possible to get a copy of the slides. I believe the slides will be uploaded on the Wine Scholar Guild website. Yes, somebody just answered. Oh yeah, Jim earlier was asking if the megas are not 181 versus the 170 listed, but as Maurizio mentioned, yes, 11 are communal megas, so 170 are the vineyard megas. And keep in mind, as far as the megas, the vineyards, these are they go from very tiny ones that are only 1.5 hectares to ones that are like 300 hectares. So there can be quite a bit of a difference. It's important to also understand that just because it says single vineyard does not mean that they are all same quality. I have a comment if you allow. Yes. Well, Brenda was asking, she's leaving for Piemonte November 19th, if she should expect rainy weather. For sure, the weather is going to be, well, unfortunately, I can't predict the weather, but yes, typically that's kind of a rainy season in Piemonte, in Italy, but in general. But, anyway, I wish you that you get some beautiful sunny days. So much. Well, thank you very much, Debbie, for the great comments here. Appreciate it. Well, so Kim is saying, of late I've heard of a blue wine, referring to initial picture of Nebbiolo punch we saw with such a striking deep aquamarine blue color skins, producing garnet color from presumably colorless juices. Amazing. Yes. Well, blue wine is a totally different thing because blue wine is practically the one you hear and you see commercially is a wine made with coloring addition because there's no such a thing in nature. No blue color, if you will, in nature. The skin of Nebbiolo, yes, is I probably did not mention, but it does have a nice intense blue coloration covered with the so-called pruina or bloom that gives that nebbia color or fog as we know Nebbiolo to be named after. I would appreciate if you could answer my question. It's about before Brandis. Sorry, I didn't see it. Where is your question? Cecilia. Okay, what is your opinion on Nebbiolo in other countries? Doesn't really travel well. Yes, you're right. Yes, Nebbiolo is definitely not a traveling grape. That's why we don't see much coming from other countries. They're not bad. I mean, if you have the opportunity to try them. But I think the main thing is that you're never gonna get what you get out of Nebbiolo from Italy. And again, when I say Italy, the northwestern part of Italy, which you have this earthy notes, you have this dry floral notes. Because when you put Nebbiolo in a much warmer environment as Australia or South America or even California for that matter, forget about even the difference of terroirs as far as soils, but just those environments that give you Nebbiolo, they're going to be fruitier, they're going to be rounder, they're going to be jammier, extracted. So there's a few differences that really have an incredible impact on the wine ultimately, which are not only the terroir, which is the main thing, but also the tradition and the culture of the place and the winemakers that you really cannot replicate somewhere else just by
Ciro?
planting a vine in another location. So
let's see if there are other questions before
thank you. Choose terrific overview. Thank you very much, Tom.
I'm happy to see that everybody enjoyed the webinar. And
thank you, Bill. Sí. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Cheryl. Does the aging requirement begin at the end of the fermentation?
Okay, Ciro, I want to thank
well,
you.
Yes, after the wine has been basically
of Nebbiolo and
after the fermentations have taken place, that's when the aging requirement process begins.
Thank everybody
the appellation, depending on
for
the
joining
local
us
requirement,
today.
but that's